Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. This video is titled, The Imaginary Climate Crisis. Democrats who just took over the House of Representatives have formed a new Climate Crisis Committee. They say the climate crisis is so bad that we only have 12 years left until the end of the Earth. The concept of a climate crisis has been a common theme since the dawn of man. Every culture has their flood myth, generally based on the idea that man's sins will lead to a great flood. Unless you have faith in the climate prophets, pay your carbon taxes and repent of your carbon sins, a terrible flood will come. It's easy for Democrats to tap into this fear because many people have been taught this idea since they were children. People always believe that the climate is changing for the worse. Here's an article from the Brisbane Courier, Tuesday, January 10, 1871. Imaginary Changes of Climate. A plentiful crop of speculation from weather prophets and projectors and half-instructed meteorologists, and all the philosophic tribe of Laputa in general, to whom the periodical press now affords such fatal facilities. Every season is sure to be extraordinary, almost every month one of the driest or wettest or windiest, coldest or hottest ever known. Much observation which ought to correct a tendency to exaggerate seems in some minds to have rather a tendency to increase it. If this sounds familiar, it's because it's exactly the same story we hear from the press now. Every month, every year is the worst in history, and they have statistics to prove it. Here's a similar article from the Des Moines Register dated Friday, October 6, 1939, Imaginary Changes in Climate. The reports generally start in wet years and their fallacy becomes evident in the dry years that follow. This myth rises over and over again, despite records showing remarkably constant and small rainfall when taken by decades. This article was written in 1939 near the end of the Dust Bowl, and sure enough, the drought ended, Iowa got green again, and they're producing lots of corn now. Weather patterns are cyclical, so it's very easy to convince people with short memories that the climate is changing. And young people like Alexandria Cortez don't know anything about history, so it's exceptionally easy to convince them of climate change. So what are the Democrats up to? Well, the great philosopher H.L. Mencken said, "The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed, and hence clamorous to be led to safety, by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary." In this video, I'm going to take a long look at the many forecasts of doom which have been put out by academics and politicians over the last 50 years. 50 years ago, one of the biggest scares was the population bomb led by Paul Ehrlich of Stanford University. New York Times, Sunday, August 10, 1969. Foe of pollution sees lack of time. The trouble with almost all environmental problems, says Paul R. Ehrlich, the population biologist, is that by the time we have enough evidence to convince people, you're dead. We must realize that unless we're extremely lucky, everybody will disappear in a cloud of blue steam in 20 years. So Ehrlich was predicting that we were all going to die by the year 1989. Had Ehrlich been correct, Alexandria Cortez would never have been born, and she wouldn't be around now to predict that the world was going to end in 12 years. In 1970, Ehrlich predicted that the oceans would be as dead as Lake Erie in less than a decade, and that America would be subject to water rationing by 1974 and food rationing by 1980. 50 years ago, Ehrlich and the New York Times were advocating the idea of poisoning the food and water supply in Africa in order to keep their population down. Tuesday, November 25, 1969, the New York Times, a sterility drug in food is hinted. Biologist stresses need to curb population growth. A possibility the government might have to put sterility drugs in reservoirs and in food shipped to foreign countries to limit human multiplication was envisioned today by a leading crusader on the population problem. Voltaire famously said, "Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities." And that's the whole point of these alarms, is to whip people up into such a frenzy that they're willing to commit all sorts of atrocities to prevent them. So 50 years ago, academics and the New York Times were advocating poisoning Africans. And Ehrlich's closest working associate was John Holdren, who went on to be President Obama's science advisor. Ehrlich forecast a dire famine by 1975. Paul Ehrlich said the time of famines is upon us and will be at its worst and most disastrous by 1975. He said the population of the United States is already too big, that birth control may have to be accomplished by making it involuntary and by putting sterilizing agents into the staple foods and drinking water, and that the church would have to go along with it. So Ehrlich not only wanted to poison Africans, but he wanted to poison Americans too. Well, we didn't starve to death by the mid-1970s as Ehrlich predicted, so he switched his story over to global cooling. Wednesday, July 31st, 1974, Stanford biologist Paul Ehrlich, author of the highly successful book The Population Bomb, is an immensely likable guy. He's also deeply concerned about the fate of the planet and all its inhabitants. Well, that's very interesting. Apparently his deep concern and love for us is the reason why he wanted to poison us. No wonder the press thought he was such a likable guy. He just wanted to commit genocide. But the article goes on. Paul Ehrlich has noticed yet another dark cloud on the horizon. Reed Bryson and some other climatologists are now pretty certain that the climate we experienced from 1930 to 1960 was the peak of a 1,000-year cycle. The world will not enjoy weather as good again for another 100 decades. Ehrlich and Holdren, who went on to be Obama's science advisor, were predicting a new ice age. And they blamed the new ice age on the burning of fossil fuels. They said the effects of a new ice age on agriculture and the supportability of a large human population scarcely need elaboration here. Even more dramatic results are possible, however. For instance, a sudden outward slumping in the Antarctic ice cap induced by added weight could generate a tidal wave of proportions unprecedented in recorded history. So climate scientists say now that collapse of the Antarctic ice sheet is imminent due to global warming. But 45 years ago they said collapse of the Antarctic ice sheet was going to be caused by global cooling. Apparently settled science tells us that the Antarctic ice cap is going to collapse no matter what happens. So let's review what we've learned from this. The burning of fossil fuels causes ice ages, and it also causes the Earth to heat out of control. And global cooling causes the Antarctic ice sheet to collapse, and global warming also causes the Antarctic ice sheet to collapse. Nothing these people are saying is consistent, but they're using their academic credentials as an excuse to scare people. And in 1975, Holdren revealed his real agenda. August 11th, 1975, Too Much Energy Too Soon, A Hazard by John Holdren. The United States is threatened far more by the hazards of too much energy too soon than by the hazards of too little too late. So 30 years later, Holdren became Obama's science advisor with the same agenda, to shut down the U.S. energy supply. Now let's look at what Obama said in 2008.
And climate change is a great example. When I was asked earlier about the issue of coal, under my plan of a cap and trade system, electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket. Even, regardless of what I say about whether coal is good or bad, because I'm capping greenhouse gases, coal power plants, natural gas, you name it, whatever the plants were, whatever the industry was, they would have to retrofit their operations. That will cost money. They will pass that money on to consumers.
So Obama wanted to make electricity prices skyrocket, and he wanted that cost passed on to consumers. And then he said he wanted to bankrupt the coal industry.
So if somebody wants to build a coal power plant, they can. It's just that it will bankrupt them because they're going to be charged a huge sum for all that greenhouse gas that's being emitted.
He was fulfilling John Holdren's dream of shutting down the U.S. energy supply. The only thing which kept Obama and Holdren from being successful was the fracking boom which occurred on private lands. I don't even think they were aware of what was going on, but instead of making electricity prices skyrocket, energy prices plummeted because of the hard work of our oil companies. The innovation of the oil companies in developing fracking during the Obama administration is the only thing which saved us from widespread misery being caused by Obama's policies. Apparently the world didn't end and we didn't all die from global cooling and from overpopulation during the 1970s as Ehrlich predicted. So by 1997 he was demanding that world leaders who went against the global warming scam be prosecuted. December 2nd, 1997, ecologist condemns Australia's moronic greenhouse stance. Professor Paul Ehrlich of Stanford University in California said yesterday that the Howard government's hardline stance against legally binding limits on greenhouse gas emissions was criminal and a gamble with the well-being of future generations. Professor Ehrlich criticized the government's seeming reluctance to acknowledge the findings of 2,500 experts that the enhanced greenhouse gas effect was real and could trigger extreme weather patterns and disasters. Remember, this is the same Paul Ehrlich who said we would all die in a cloud of blue steam by the year 1990. And he also said that global cooling was real, it was going to cause an ice age, and could trigger extreme weather patterns and disasters. But let's go back now to the global cooling scare of the 1970s. In 1971, the Washington Post and NASA's leading climate scientists warned that the world could be as little as 50 or 60 years away from a disastrous new ice age. 50 years from 1971 is coming up really soon. That means we only have one more year until the ice age begins. Another prominent scientist from the National Center for Atmospheric Research, James Lodge, also predicted a new ice age by the 21st century. And he made some other stunning predictions too. He warned that if the current rate of increase in electrical power generation continued, the demands for cooling water would boil dry the entire flow of the rivers and streams of the continental United States. And he also said that population control was needed to prevent these disasters. Well, here we are in the 21st century. I don't think we've had an ice age yet, although it feels that way in Boulder this week. And it doesn't seem to me like the rivers ran dry in the United States either. Another prominent scientist, Francis Steele from Case Western Institute, gave a little more conservative forecast. He said we had 200 years till the next ice age started. In 1972, 42 top American and European investigators met at Brown University, and they were so worried about a new ice age that they sent a letter to President Nixon warning of a new ice age in about a century. Here's another article from 1980. New ice age may soon grip cooling Earth. 3 winters ago, snow fell in Miami. 2 winters ago, the Great Lakes and Mississippi Basin suffered deadly record cold. Last winter, in addition to severe cold, crazy 140-mile-per-hour winds lashed New England. In Western Europe, those winds left 38 people dead. In Los Angeles, the most intense rain natives have ever seen inundated their city, washing hundreds of homes off their foundations and down muddy hillsides, piling cars atop one another in underground garages, and killing at least 36 people. The express train of rainstorms that overran Los Angeles also flooded Phoenix, while 1,000 miles to the north, record snowfall engulfed Seattle. So the record snowfall in Seattle that year was blamed on global cooling. But the record snowfall in Seattle this year is blamed on global warming. I was living in Phoenix during those floods, and the Salt River had more water in it than the Mississippi did. In fact, I was actually living in Scottsdale and working in Tempe, and every single bridge except for one washed out. It was about a 2-hour commute getting across the river. This is what Scottsdale looked like last week. Climate alarmists tell us that this is caused by an overheated atmosphere. Anyway, back to the article. Something strange is happening to weather throughout the world. Chills and droughts in recent years have had not only here but also in Europe, Africa, Asia, New Zealand, and South America. And here's the issue of Science News from March 1st, 1975. The Ice Age cometh. Glaciers plowing through Manhattan. Domes over cities. Climate change, chilling possibilities. The unusually beneficial climate of the past few decades may be degenerating, facing humanity with a new challenge to survival. So back then, a warm climate was considered a good thing, and a cold climate was considered a bad thing. And that actually made sense. People prosper in warm weather. They don't do well in the cold. And here's another article from 1973. Scientists predict a new ice age. We can't expect the present warm age to last much longer. World may be facing a new little ice age. The armadillo's migrating south. Earth is cooling. Return of ice age feared. Snowbanks cover areas of Baffin Island today which were seasonally snow-free 30 or 40 years before the present cooling. J.T. Andrews and his colleagues at the University of Colorado at Boulder report. Similarly, pack ice around Iceland is once again becoming the serious hindrance to navigation it was during the Little Ice Age of the 17th and 18th centuries. C. Bertrand Schultz of the University of Nebraska State Museum in Lincoln finds that warmth-loving animals such as the armadillos, which expanded northward into the American Midwest in the first half of this century, are now retreating again. March 9th, 1980, new ice age may soon grip cooling Earth. 3 winters ago, snow fell in Miami. 2 winters ago, the Great Lakes and Mississippi Basin suffered deadly record cold. Last winter, in addition to severe cold, crazy 140-mile-per-hour winds lashed New England. In Western Europe, these winds left 38 people dead. Even near the equator in subtropical Brazil, where winter supposedly never comes, snow and frost repeatedly have devastated the coffee plantations and sent world prices for coffee beans soaring. The weather patterns of our planet are becoming unstable, the National Academy of Sciences warned in 1975. So global cooling makes the weather unstable, and now climate scientists tell us that global warming does the same thing. June 12, 1975, weather science suggests another ice age ahead. Is Earth headed into another ice age? A recent Japanese study found the weather during the past 10 years has been bizarre with droughts, severe cold waves, heavy rains, and unusual warm spells. This pattern of major deviations from Earth's norm shows no sign of abating. Global cooling. We can call the cooling trend ominous in the sense that if it continues long enough, it will eventually get us into all kinds of trouble, said J. Murray Mitchell, climatologist with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Here's another one. Time magazine, June 24, 1974. Another ice age. In Africa, drought continues for the 6th consecutive year, adding terribly to the toll of famine victims. During 1972, record rains in parts of the U.S. and Pakistan and Japan caused some of the worst flooding in centuries. The trend shows no indication of reversing. Climatological Cassandras are becoming increasingly apprehensive, for the weather aberrations they're studying may be the harbinger of another ice age. Telltale signs are everywhere, from the unexpected persistence and thickness of pack ice in the waters around Iceland to the southward migration of warmth-loving creature like the armadillo from the Midwest. Front page of Chicago Tribune, March 2nd, 1975. It's getting colder. Brr, new ice age on way soon. In the last decade, the Arctic ice and snowcaps has expanded 12%, and for the first time in this century, ships making for Iceland ports have been impeded by drifting ice. Many climatologists see these signs as evidence that a significant shift in the climate is taking place, a shift that could be the forerunner of an ice age like that which gripped much of the northern hemisphere before retreating 10,000 years ago. The Guardian, Tuesday, January 29, 1974. Space satellites show new ice age coming fast. Worldwide and rapid trends towards a mini ice age are emerging from the first long-term analysis of satellite and weather pictures. Well, the Guardian is now the leading climate alarmist for global warming, but back then they were pushing global cooling pretty hard. In 1974, 2 of the leading climate scientists in the world, Stephen Schneider from the National Center for Atmospheric Research and Dr. Walter Orr Roberts, who is director of the National Center for Atmospheric Research, were also pushing the idea of a new ice age. Boulder, Colorado, observers of the global climate at the National Center for Atmospheric Research believe the favorable weather of the past 15 years is about to give way to a period of unstable crop losses, food shortages, and death by starvation for millions. Underlying Schneider's ideas on food shortages is the knowledge that the world is moving into a period of cooler temperatures. Well, maybe Schneider and Roberts were correct. Here in Boulder, we just had our coldest March afternoon on record on Sunday. The high temperature was 6 degrees. It felt like an ice age. The National Center for Atmospheric Research is located on top of this hill right here. I ride my bike up there every day to check out how the global warming is doing. In 1976, Stephen Schneider from NCAR wrote a book discussing the global cooling consensus. New York Times Book Review, July 18, 1976, The Cooling. So writes Stephen Schneider, a young climatologist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, reflecting the consensus of the climatological community. In his new book, The Genesis Strategy, his warning that present world food reserves are an insufficient hedge against future famines has been heard among the scientific community for years. For example, it was the conclusion of a 1975 National Academy of Sciences report. But Schneider has decided to explain the entire problem as responsibly and accurately as he can to the general public, and thus has put together a useful and important book. Schneider quotes University of Wisconsin climatologist Reed Bryson as saying that the 1930 to 1960s was the most abnormal period in 1,000 years, abnormally mild. In fact, conditions of steady warm weather in the northern hemisphere during that time favored bumper harvests in the United States, the Soviet Union, and the wheat belt of northern India and Pakistan. In 1974, Schneider and Bryson tried to explain to a White House policy-making group why conditions are likely to worsen, i.e. get cold. One of the most depressing anecdotes in the book is Schneider's description of the deaf ear their warnings received. So in the 1970s, climate scientists believed that warm weather was good and made for a steady climate, but cold weather was bad and made for an unstable, erratic climate. And they were particularly upset that the Republican in the White House didn't listen to their warnings about global cooling. Same story as now, except that now they're pimping global warming instead of global cooling. And here's a 1976 article from National Geographic. Just what's going on with the climate? What changes are taking place around us? From 1880 to about 1940, the world, particularly the northern hemisphere, went through a period of significant warming. I heard from a tall, quiet-spoken Dr. J. Murray Mitchell of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. He's one of this nation's most respected climatologists. He went on, but since about 1940, there's been a distinct drop in average global temperature. It's fallen about half a degree, even more on the high latitudes of the northern hemisphere. England's annual growing season shrank by 9 or 10 days between 1950 and 1966, Hubert Lamb of the Climatic Research Unit in England has noted. In the northern tier of the U.S. Midwest, summer frosts again occasionally damage crops. Sea ice has returned to Iceland's coast after more than 40 years of virtual absence. During the last 20 to 30 years, world temperature has fallen irregularly at first, more sharply over the past decade. U.S. National Science Board, 1974. Glaciers in Alaska and Scandinavia have slowed their recession. Some in Switzerland have actually begun advancing again. In 1974, the New York Times reported that scientists at the National Academy of Sciences wanted to evacuate 6 million people to save them from colder, more erratic weather. July 21, 1974, Des Moines Sunday Register. Droughts, floods, blizzards, tornadoes, typhoons, and hurricanes have plagued much of the nation and the world in recent years. Climatologists now believe for the long run there's been a mounting evidence of a worldwide cooling trend. Global cooling may be the cause of the devastating African drought now in its 6th year. As science learns more and more about the weather and climate, more schemes and control are suggested. So look at all those horrible things which global cooling caused. Droughts, floods, blizzards, tornadoes, typhoons, and hurricanes. Starvation in Africa. But scientists were on top of things. They had schemes to rescue the world from global cooling. They were going to dam the Bering Strait and melt the Arctic. But that wasn't the climatologists' only scheme to stop global cooling. Another plan was to melt the Arctic ice cap by covering it with black soot. Newsweek, April 28, 1975, The Cooling World. So in 1975, scientists wanted to put soot on the Arctic ice cap to make it melt, but now they're talking about putting soot in the atmosphere to make the Arctic ice cap expand. They seem to really like soot. All this global cooling propaganda which they were promoting in the 1970s is very bad news for climate scientists who want you to believe that they're competent. So look how they handled it. They simply tried to erase it. Scientific American, January 10, 2014, How the Global Cooling Story Came to Be. 9 paragraphs written for Newsweek in 1975 continue to trump 40 years of climate science. It's a record that has its author amazed. This is an incredibly Orwellian attempt to rewrite the past. They're trying to say that the entire global cooling story was these paragraphs right here, when in fact it was massive. I have thousands and thousands of these articles from the 1970s. It was the consensus. Yes, there were a few scientists pushing global warming in the 1970s, but they weren't the consensus. There were lots and lots of people pushing global cooling, including NASA's top climate scientists, NCAR's top climate scientists, and NOAA's top climate scientists. Alarmism can't exist if people remember the past, so that's why climate alarmists are trying to erase and rewrite it. So let's take a little break from the climate alarmism for a minute and look at some of the other scares which were going on in the 1970s. New York Times, Friday, March 4th, 1977. Carter's oil problem. The hard truth, as the Carter administration sees it, is that the world's oil supplies cannot much longer sustain the world's increasing oil consumption. The world's oil would disappear in the first decade of the 21st century. Oh no, we must be out of oil now. We're already in the second decade and almost in the third decade of the 21st century. And here was the big scare from 1979 which ended our push for nuclear power. The China Syndrome, a film dramatizing America's worst fears of what could happen if a nuclear power plant suffered a critical malfunction, opened at theaters across the nation last week, sending shockwaves through audiences in the nuclear energy industry. They concluded that an area the size of Pennsylvania could be rendered uninhabitable by the China Syndrome. The China Syndrome was the idea that a nuclear reactor core would melt down and melt all the way through the earth to China. So the same alarmists who are pushing the global warming scam also destroyed nuclear power industry, which was the only thing which could have saved them from fossil fuels. 1979 was also around the time when the global warming scam started to take off. The New York Times, Wednesday, February 14, 1979. Climatologists are warned North Pole might melt because of rapid increases in fuel burning and consequent rise in atmospheric carbon dioxide. The United States, Eastern Siberia, and Western Europe would be cooled by as much as 16 degrees Fahrenheit. Wow, so global warming was going to freeze us to death. And global cooling was also going to freeze us to death. New York Times, January 5th, 1978. International team of specialists finds no end in sight to 30-year cooling trend in the northern hemisphere. Global cooling was going to freeze us. Global warming was going to freeze us. We were going to run out of oil, and nuclear reactors were going to melt through the earth and make the world uninhabitable. And acid rain was going to kill us too. February 7th, 1980. Philadelphia, he doesn't see it, feel it, or smell it, but when it rains or snows east of the Mississippi, sulfuric acid falls on a man's head. Well, at least now I know what happened to my hair. But they weren't quite done with the global cooling scare yet. Chicago Tribune, Wednesday, November 25, 1981. Many authorities on population growth and food supply now fear that the world is close to the brink of a Malthusian disaster. In fact, several ominous developments in recent years have brought us closer to the edge of this abyss. Climatologists now blame recurring droughts and floods on a global cooling trend that could trigger massive tragedies for mankind. Well, wait a minute, I thought it was global warming that was going to cause massive tragedies, and scientists wanted global cooling. It's really hard to keep up with these alarmists and all their predictions of doom. And they really ramped things up in the 1980s. June 30th, 1989, a senior environmental official at the United Nations, Noel Brown, says entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if global warming is not reversed by the year 2000. Coastal flooding and crop failures would create an exodus of eco-refugees, threatening political chaos, said Brown, director of the New York office of the UN Environment Program. He said governments have a 10-year window of opportunity to solve the greenhouse effect before it goes beyond human control. So right before Alexandria Cortez was born in 1989, the UN warned that we only had until the year 2000 to save the world from global warming. And now she says we only have 12 more years. So who needs Monty Python and the Holy Grail skits when we have this sort of clown show going on from senior officials in the United Nations and scientists in the press? And of course the best comedy coming from the politicians themselves. Well, I'm pretty sure we survived the UN's 2000 deadline, and in 2017 they updated it to 2020. We have one more year to avert climate catastrophe, experts say. And in 1989, they also announced that the only way we could stop global warming was through global communism. Canberra Times, Thursday, January 26, 1989. Call for anti-greenhouse action. Governments must yield national sovereignty to multilateral authorities able to enforce laws across environmentally invisible frontiers if the greenhouse effect, which threatens the future of all nations, is to be overcome, the Commonwealth Secretary General said on Tuesday. Governments must yield national sovereignty to multilateral authorities able to enforce laws across environmentally invisible frontiers if the greenhouse effect, which threatens the future of whole nations, is to be overcome, the Commonwealth Secretary General said on Tuesday. An expert group set up to look at climate change estimated there's a 90% certainty that sea level would rise between 1 and 4 meters by the year 2030. Wow, 4 meters of sea level rise in the next 10 years. That sounds pretty awful. And not only that, the Maldives are going to completely drown by the year 2018. Canberra Times, Monday, September 26, 1988. Threat to islands, Maldives. Sea level is threatening to completely cover this Indian Ocean nation of 1,196 small islands within the next 30 years, according to authorities. But the end of the Maldives and its 200,000 people could come much sooner if drinking water supplies dry up by 1992, as predicted. So those poor people in the Maldives died of thirst 25 years ago, and then they drowned last year. But wait a minute, the picture on the right was taken this week. Looks to me like people are doing pretty well there. I think I'd rather be in the 80-degree weather in the Maldives this week than the sub-zero weather we're having here in Boulder. Both places have lots of white stuff on the ground, but frankly the Maldives looks like a much better place to be this week. And not only were the Maldives supposed to drown by last year, but Lower Manhattan was supposed to drown too. In 1988, James Hansen of NASA started the global warming scare in earnest. This is the front page of the New York Times from June 24, 1988. Global warming has begun, expert tells Senate. And here's one of Hansen's best predictions from 1988, written up in Salon magazine. While doing research 12 or 13 years ago, I met Jim Hansen, the scientist who in 1988 predicted the greenhouse effect for Congress. I went over to the window with him and looked out on Broadway in New York City and said, "If what you're saying about the greenhouse effect is true, is anything going to look different down there in 20 years?" He looked for a while and was quiet and didn't say anything for a couple seconds. Then he said, "Well, there'll be more traffic." I, of course, didn't think he heard the question right. Then he explained. The West Side Highway, which runs along the Hudson River, will be underwater, and there'll be tape across the windows across the street because of the high winds, and the same birds won't be there. The trees in the median strip will change. Then he said there'll be more police cars. Why? Well, you know what happens to crime when the heat goes up. Didn't he also say the restaurants would have signs in their windows that read, "Water by request only"? Under the greenhouse effect, extreme weather increases. Depending on where you are in terms of the hydrological cycle, you get more of whatever you're prone to get. New York can get droughts, the droughts can get more severe, and you'll have signs in restaurants saying "water by request only." I found this prediction particularly amusing because I used to go visit my grandparents on Long Island during the 1960s in the summer, and they were having a very bad drought during the 1960s, which lasted for several years. New York was fighting with Philadelphia over water in the Delaware River and actually came within a couple weeks of running out entirely. And during the summer of 1966 or 1967, restaurants in New York literally had signs up saying, "Water by request only." It was a city ordinance. I thought it was great as a kid because normally my parents wouldn't let me order soft drinks in restaurants. But on this occasion, the city was making it mandatory. The northeastern United States was in drought quite frequently prior to 1970, but since the 1970s, droughts have almost never happened anymore. But let's go back to the article now. When did he say this will all happen? Within 20 or 30 years, and remember we had this conversation in 1988 or 1989. Does he still believe these things? Yes, he still believes everything. I talked to him a few months ago and he said he wouldn't change anything that he said then. So according to the world's leading climate expert, Lower Manhattan's can be underwater no later than 2018 or 2019. That's this year. Well, there's no question that Wall Street's underwater since Nancy Pelosi took over Congress in 2019, but that's a different story. And remember, Paul Ehrlich said that if you don't believe people like Hansen, you're a criminal. Either accept the fact that Manhattan's underwater and the Maldives are underwater, or go to jail. In 2008, Hansen also predicted the Arctic would be ice-free within 10 years. Well, that would have been last year. Tuesday, June 24th, 2008 by Seth Borenstein. NASA scientists were toast. Hansen, echoing work by other scientists, said that in 5 to 10 years the Arctic will be free of sea ice in the summer. And Representative Ed Markey, Democrat of Massachusetts committee chairman, said, Dr. Hansen was right. 20 years later we recognize him as a climate prophet. But Dr. Hansen was being conservative. Nobel laureate Al Gore said the ice cap would be gone by summer of 2014. And in 2013, leading Arctic expert Peter Wadhams of Cambridge University said the Arctic would be ice-free by 2015. Ice-free Arctic in 2 years heralds methane catastrophe, scientist. Peter Wadhams, co-author of the new Nature paper on costs of Arctic warming, explains the danger of inaction. And it was written right there in The Guardian, the paper of record about the climate. The same paper which told us 45 years ago that space satellites show new ice age coming fast. Well, their 2015 ice-free Arctic prediction didn't work out, so The Guardian changed their story to 2016. U.S. Navy predicts summer ice-free by 2016. Well, their 2016 forecast didn't work out either, so they changed their story again in 2016. Next year or the year after that, the Arctic will be free of ice. So how's the Arctic doing? This is a map from this week from the National Snow and Ice Data Center in Boulder, Colorado. The orange line is the 1981 to 2010 median ice edge. So you can see the ice is normal just about everywhere, except for in the Bering Sea. And the reason the Bering Sea ice is below normal is because there's been very strong jet stream winds coming up from the south, going up into the Arctic, and then bringing record cold air down into Canada and the United States. And these winds have been pushing the ice edge back towards the Arctic center. It has nothing to do with global warming. There's lots of ice in the Arctic. All the predictions were wrong. And here's another great prediction from The Guardian from 2005. 50 million environmental refugees by the end of the decade, UN warns. There are well-founded fears that the number of people fleeing untenable environmental conditions may grow exponentially as the world experiences the effects of climate change. Well, I'm fleeing Colorado next week and going down to warm up in Arizona. I'm tired of all this cold weather. And here's another great one from The Guardian from 2004. Now the Pentagon tells Bush climate change will destroy us. Britain will be Siberian in less than 20 years. Climate change over the next 20 years could result in a global catastrophe costing millions of lives in wars and natural disasters. A secret report, suppressed by U.S. defense chiefs and obtained by The Observer, warns that major European cities will be sunk beneath rising seas as Britain is plunged into a Siberian climate by the year 2020. That's next year. Nuclear conflict, megadroughts, famine, and widespread rioting will erupt across the world. Well, I hope nobody in Britain is wasting their time watching the Manchester United PSG football match today. They should be packing their bags and fleeing before they become a Siberian climate next year. And Paris is going to be underwater anyway. This super secret defense report was just too scary for the public to know about. And not only that, in 2012, The Guardian and the UK Environment Secretary announced that drought was the new normal for the UK. They're in a permanent drought now. And not only is the UK in a permanent drought, but Australia is too. This drought may never break. January 4th, 2008, Sydney Morning Herald. It may be time to stop describing southeastern Australia's grip by drought and instead accept the extreme dry as permanent, one of the nation's most senior weather experts warned yesterday. Perhaps we should call it our new climate, said the Bureau of Meteorology's head of climate analysis, David Jones. Climate experts told us for years that global warming was going to ruin skiing, it was going to be the end of the Winter Olympics, there wasn't going to be any more snow. But in 1996, New York had a huge blizzard, and of course the New York Times blamed it on global warming. And then in 2007, the New York Times announced the end of snow because of global warming. How do you ski if there's no snow? November 1st, 2007. Organizers of a United Nations conference in Switzerland said tourist destinations would be affected by global warming. In 2006, the New York Times announced the endless summer. December 21st, 2006, with warmer weather, different decisions to make. It's not that I don't like 60-degree days and eating fresh spinach right out of my garden in December, but the extended growing season is one of the signs of global warming. It goes hand in hand with polar bears dying in the Arctic as the sea ice shrinks. But then in the year 2010, the New York Times announced that cold and snow was caused by global warming. Bundle up, it's global warming, December 25th, 2010. The Earth continues to get warmer, yet it's feeling a lot colder outside. Over the past few weeks, sub-zero temperatures in Poland claimed 66 lives. Snow arrived in Seattle well before the winter solstice and fell heavily enough in Minneapolis to make the roof of the Metrodome collapse. And last week, blizzards closed Europe's busiest airports in London and Frankfurt for days, stranding holiday travelers. The snow and record cold have invaded the eastern United States, with more bad weather predicted. All of this cold was met with perfect comic timing by the release of a World Meteorological Organization report showing that 2010 will probably be among the 3 warmest years on record, and 2001 through 2010 the warmest decade on record. How can we reconcile this? The not-so-obvious short answer is that the overall warming of the atmosphere is actually creating cold weather extremes. Last winter, too, was exceptionally snowy and cold across the eastern United States and Eurasia, as were 7 of the previous 9 winters. Wow, so global warming makes it really cold and snowy. But then in 2012, the New York Times went back to announcing the endless summer, July 18th, 2012. Here's what American exceptionalism means now. On a per capita basis, we either lead or come close to leading the world in consumption of resources, production of pollutants, and a profound unwillingness to do anything about it. We may look back upon this year as the one in which climate change began to wreak serious havoc, yet we hear almost no conversation about changing policy or behavior. President Obama has done nicely in raising fuel averages for automobiles, but he came into office promising much more, and Mitt Romney promises even less. Wow, so Americans have wrecked winter. That sounds really awful. And in 2014, the New York Times again announced the end of snow. But now the New York Times is back to their story that global warming causes lots of cold and snow. Brace for the polar vortex. It may be visiting more often. So I think it's pretty clear what's going on here. The New York Times and other climate alarmists change their story every time the weather changes, and they're just hoping that people's memories are short and they don't remember what they said last time. And here's a great one from the Washington Post from 2012. Could cherry blossoms one day be blooming in winter? Washington's cherry blossoms are busting out early this year, with buds popping so fast that a government work crew this week watched them unfurl on one tree in a single day. The U.S. National Park Service had predicted an early bloom for the centennial year of the hallowed trees, but it's moved up the forecast twice, with temperatures in the 80s and more of the same expected. Now comes a team of scientists theorizing that with drastic warming of the globe, future decades could see blossom signs not just a few days early, but advanced by almost a month. That could mean a bloom process which begins in January rather than February, a blooming period in February instead of March, and a peak bloom in early March instead of early April, the research suggests. Well, let's look at what's actually happened with Washington, D.C. bloom dates since James Hansen made his prediction there in 1988. Well, they've gotten a few days later, and 4 of the last 6 years have been much later than normal. And this year is also going to be late because of all the cold weather they're having in the East Coast. 19 years ago, the UK Independent announced that snowfalls are now just a thing of the past, and they quoted UK climate expert David Viner as saying, "Children just aren't going to know what snow is." Here's the Northern Hemisphere snow cover graph from the Rutgers University Global Snow Lab. It covers the period from the 1960s until the present, and you can see 1988, this is when James Hansen gave his testimony before Congress. Snow cover was really low back then, but since then it's been steadily increasing, and in recent years it's been above the long-term mean. All this anecdotal belief that snow's disappearing and the Olympics are going to be ruined just isn't supported by evidence. The snow trend's been going the other direction. And in fact, fall and winter snow cover, which are the seasons when the snow falls, have been increasing rapidly and have been at record levels in recent years. California skiers set their all-time record for snow 2 years ago, and this year is ahead of 2 years ago's record rate for snowfall. This is Squaw Valley this morning. They're completely buried in snow. The Winter Olympics was held in Squaw Valley in 1960 and almost had to be canceled because of a lack of snow back during the global cooling scare. If it wasn't for the pioneering snow equipment they had in 1960, they probably would have had to have canceled many of the skiing events. But today Squaw Valley has so much snow they probably won't even be able to open up. As is the case with most climate forecasts, the trend has been the exact opposite of what the experts predicted. We're getting lots and lots of snow. And here's a great 2011 forecast from President Clinton's science advisor Joe Romm. Dust storm marks beginning of Southwest's permanent drought. I spent most of the last 6 months working down in Phoenix, and they've had one of the wettest 6-month periods on record. And this is what Scottsdale looked like last week. Last week, Flagstaff set their all-time one-day snow record of 36 inches. And the snow wasn't just last week. I took this picture on New Year's Day out in the desert out east of Phoenix. This is the second time this year there's been a big snowstorm on the cactus. I can't remember a single other year when that happened. So Joe Romm has changed his story, and now he says that cold and snow is caused by global warming. But the comedy is just beginning. In 2004, the chief scientists of the UK said we were all going to have to move to Antarctica because it's going to be too hot here. The Independent Environment, Why Antarctica Will Soon Be the Only Place to Live, literally, by Jeffrey Lean, Environment Editor, Sunday, 2nd May 2004. Antarctica is likely to be the world's only habitable continent by the end of this century if global warming remains unchecked, the government's chief scientist, Professor David King, said last week. And in 2008, right there in the Telegraph, Climate Change Today predicts refugees fleeing into Antarctica, where it's like minus 120 degrees. The kinds of incredible nonsense which comes out of the mouths of climate scientists is almost beyond comprehension. Well, maybe we'll have to move to Antarctica to warm up. This week, Montana set their all-time March cold temperature record. We did the same thing here in Boulder. A few weeks ago, Illinois set their all-time record cold temperature, as did Hawaii. This isn't looking much like the endless summer which the New York Times kept telling us about. So we didn't all die of starvation in the 1970s as Paul Ehrlich predicted, and we didn't die in a cloud of blue steam as he predicted by 1990, but he's still making the same forecast. Paul Ehrlich, collapse of civilization is a near certainty within decades, and right there in The Guardian. So in 1969, Paul Ehrlich wanted to poison Africans in order to solve the overpopulation problem, but he also said that he wanted to get rid of the rich people too. Burlington Free Press, April 6, 1990. The most common misconception of the population problem is that it's a problem of poor Indians who don't know how to use condoms. Actually, the problem in the world is that there's too many rich people. It's pretty clear what's going on here. These alarmists simply want to reduce the world's population, and they want to do it by any means they can. And they found themselves the perfect patsy with Alexandria Cortez. What better way to reduce the world's population than to cut off our energy supply? Everything we depend on to survive, food, water, heat, light, power, communications, depends on a reliable supply of energy. And we're completely dependent on fossil fuels to stay alive. So by convincing Alexandria Cortez that we're all going to die in 12 years unless we cut off the supply of fossil fuels, alarmists who are hoping to reduce the Earth's population are hoping the hysteria they created will cause people to do really stupid things and cause exactly that to happen. Voltaire said, "Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities." This alarmist hysteria is nothing new. The Incas sacrificed children to appease the gods. Same story with the Mayans and the Aztecs. They sacrificed countless numbers of people in order to protect themselves from drought. If you remember your history, Cortez conquered the Aztecs and reported on the unbelievable atrocities which were going on then. Massive sacrifices were occurring largely to protect themselves from bad weather. I wonder if Alexandria Cortez is a descendant of Cortez the Conqueror. And Hawaiians did very similar things. Their high priests would beat people to death, countless numbers of them, and then eat their flesh. They believed that the gods required this in order to protect them from natural disasters like volcanoes. I'm a Jew, and my people were nearly exterminated due to mindless hate and superstition. The Nazis were stating very explicitly what they intended to do. They wanted to wipe out the Jews, but most Jews didn't listen. They just didn't believe it could possibly happen. November 1939, Nazi Germany begins work of driving Jews into ghettos with new drastic decrees. The official phase of Nazi Germany's anti-Jewish program was opened today with a law forbidding Jews to possess firearms or other weapons. This law was the first of a series designed to effect a permanent solution of the Jewish problem, which meant wiping us out. The Nazis knew that it was pretty hard to load armed people into boxcars. We need to listen to what these alarmists are saying. Prince Philip, who's head of the World Wildlife Fund, said, "If I were reincarnated, I would wish to be returned to Earth as a killer virus to lower human population levels. They want us dead." Paul Ehrlich wanted to poison Africans. He also wanted to kill Americans and rich people. Edmund Burke said, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." All of these failed predictions by alarmists would be comedic if we didn't look at what their actual intention was. They want to reduce world population levels, and they want to do it by any means possible. What better way to do it than by getting us to agree to cut off our own essential energy supply, which keeps us alive? This alarmism is not a game. These people are dead serious, and we need to stop them. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.